Senator Seselja.
Thank you, Mr President. My question is to the Minister for Human Services, Senator Payne, representing the Minister for Education. Given the many benefits to students from the government's higher education reforms, can the minister advise the Senate why students should reject the scare campaign against these reforms?
Order. Order on my left. The Minister. Order, Senator Lyons. The Minister for Human Services, Senator Payne.
Thank you very much, Mr President, and I thank Senator Seselja for the question. He's absolutely right, Mr President. There are enormous benefits for students in these higher education reforms. For a start, they will ensure access to the best higher education possible in Australia. They will have massive scholarship support.
On my left.
There will be Commonwealth support for all Australian undergraduates, meaning lower fees for many and better pathways into higher education. So students should reject the scare campaign because it just is not true. In fact, just today, Dr Jeff Sharrock of the LH Martin Institute at the University of Melbourne has published an article which is headed "Labor's $100,000 degree projections are misleading," and he proves why. He says the problem is that the ALP's debt sentence case studies are misleading. Even the Shadow Assistant Treasurer, Dr Andrew Lee, he gives the lie to the scare campaign on fees when he says there's no reason to think that fee deregulation will adversely affect poorer students. He knows that because under HECS, no student needs to pay a cent up front and no one needs to repay anything until they're earning over $50,000, Mr President. And universities have made it clear that there will not be the exorbitant fees claimed by the scare campaigners. In fact, the so-called modelling which the scare campaign uses is typically pure invention. What about the NTEU, Mr President? What they do is they take a figure, then they add a mystery 25% surcharge, and then they double it. Why don't you just pluck it from mid-air, Mr President? It would just be just as credible. But fortunately, students overwhelmingly realise that undertaking higher education is the best investment in their future and in themselves that they will ever make.
Thank you, Minister. Senator Seselja, a supplementary question.
Thank you, Mr President. Thank you, Minister. Can the minister inform the Senate of the views of higher education leaders about the scare campaign against these reforms?
Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr President. I note that Senator Conroy refers to higher education leaders as rent seekers, which is interesting. So nobody over there will be at Universities Australia's reception next week, will you? No, you're not hypocrites. All of the university groupings in Australia, Mr President, have made clear that there will not be exorbitant fee increases. Let's start with the Australian Technology Network and Vicky Thompson, who says, and I quote, "Don't be fooled by $100,000 degrees. The university sector is not looking to introduce standard $100,000 degrees, and deregulation won't deliver them. I repeat, there is nothing to fear from deregulated fees for undergraduate degrees." Universities are not stupid. They know if they set their prices too high, they'll end up with empty lecture theatres, Mr President. And in fact, Open Universities Australia and Coffee have both said that there'll be significant fee reductions. But don't let the truth get in the way of a good story for those opposite.
On my left.
The Regional University Network, Mr President, says the RUN considers that the only way the sector can maintain quality.
Has expired. Order. Senator Conroy. Senator Seselja.
Thank you, Mr President. Can the minister further advise the Senate how the government's reforms will ensure that higher education is affordable and accessible for students?
Order. On my left. On my left. Senator Wong. Minister.
Thank you very much, Mr President. I do want to complete the quote also from the Regional University Network, because that is very important about accessibility and affordability for students, as Senator Seselja has just asked. The Regional University Network considers that the only way the sector can maintain quality and remain internationally competitive is through the deregulation of student fees. That is a quote, Mr President, from the Regional University Network. But in terms of affordability and accessibility, and particularly for disadvantaged students, Mr President, we all know under HECS that no student needs to pay anything up front and doesn't need to repay until they're earning $50,000.
Order on my left.
You know, they interject about student debt, Mr President, and as I've made clear in the chamber previously, as Minister Pyne has said repeatedly, the government is open to considering alternative approaches to the interest rate. We welcome constructive suggestions, but we won't hold our breath for any from those opposite, will we? Perhaps we might look elsewhere around the chamber to people who are prepared to be constructive in relation to this matter.
Thank you, Minister. The time for answering the question has expired.